It gets dark very early this time of year this far north. By 4:300 p.m., the sun is already set and dusk is upon us. Definitely not the ideal conditions for a girl who looks as young as I do to be walking home alone. The route that I'd chosen from the junior high school to the house was particularly off the beaten track and took me through several tranquil and deserted areas of town. No parent with even a shred of love in their heart for their child would allow them to make this walk at any time of year, let alone in the depths of winter. It was just after I'd passed the cemetery and was about to turn onto the path through the woods that I became aware of his presence. At this point, he was what you would consider a safe distance behind me. I didn't want to turn around and look directly at him. Still, I could tell from the heavy footfall of his steps and the excited nature of his breathing that he was about 30 or 40 feet away. There were no other people around, and this road was a dead end with no houses on it, meaning that the chances of someone driving by were minimal. I was acutely aware that it was just him and me. Despite many thoughts running through my mind at that moment, one above all was controlling me. If this situation is going to go down the way I think it will, I need to make a move right now. I started to quicken my pace, not so much that it would be immediately apparent, but enough that I would significantly increase the distance between him and me. Unless, that is, he really was following me and altered his speed to keep up. Sure enough, within a couple of seconds, I sensed him breaking into a slow jog in order to catch up and close the distance between us. Okay, Carmilla, time to make a choice. Do I run or do I turn and confront this man? I was right at the head of the woodland park at this point, so I decided to turn around. Hello, mister. Can I help you with something? Are you lost? I detected the slightest hint of surprise that I'd acted in this way. Still, he quickly regained his composure and continued his slow approach. He there, little girl. I was just out here looking for my dog. I think he went into these woods. Do you want to help me find him? He was smiling at me now. What's your dog's name? I asked. What? Your dog's name. What is it? If I'm going to help you find him, I need to shout his name? Oh, yeah. His name is Fred. Was he surprised by my question, or had he hesitated because he'd needed to make up a name? Well, I'm kind of scared of dogs. I think I'm just going to go home. Sorry I can't help you. Can I at least walk you home? Which way are you headed? It's dark out here and not safe for little girls like you. He was edging ever closer to me now and had a big, creepy smile plastered across his face. I live just on the other side of these woods. Trust me, I can make it just fine. I'd still like to walk with you if that's okay. I'm sure my dog is in there somewhere. His icy blue eyes were laser, focused on mine now. It almost felt like he was trying to hypnotically control me with his gaze. If you really think Fido is in there, I guess you should look for him. Fido is a crazy old mutt, he said. I'm sure I will find him in there. Thier is no dog. This man definitely means trouble. Time to take action. I turned and started running into the woods. While I had a couple of seconds head start on him, the fact is that the body of a 13-year-old girl can't run as fast as a fully grown man. He caught up with me ridiculously fast, so quickly, in fact, that we were still within view of the road. The street lamp gave off enough light for us to be seen by a passerby if one were to approach. What did you run off for? He asked. I'm not going to hurt you. Sorry, mister. I just got scared at the thought of your dog running around in here. I got bitten by something pretty nasty when I was younger, and the thought of it happening again freaks me out. Okay, I understand. Let's keep walking. and I'll keep you safe from any stray dogs. Hey, are you hungry? I have some food I could share with you. Let's find a nice place to sit down and eat. What do you have? I was kind of hungry, as it happened. Delicious homemade spaghetti and bolognese sauce. Let's go a bit further into the woods, and then I'll share it with you. He didn't have a bag with him, and there was no way he was hiding some container full of food in his pockets. This was bullshit. No thanks, mister. My elders say I'm allergic to garlic, so I shouldn't eat Italian food. Okay then. Let's just keep walking. His heart rate was increasing, and the adrenaline was kicking in. I could smell the excitement oozing from his pores. Here, let me hold your hand. You will be safer that way. He didn't wait for me to respond, grabbing my hand in his clammy grip. He was a strong one, it was apparent. There was no way a regular girl of my height and frame would be able to escape this bastard. We walked on, and were soon far away from any streetlight and any semblance of safety. Soon, things were going to take a turn very much for the worse. He clearly sensed this, too, letting go of my hand and standing in front of me to block the path. The disingenuous smile had gone now. Okay, little lady, fun time is over. Well, for you anyway. My fun is just about to begin. He withdrew a set of handcuffs from his pocket and dangled them in front of my face. I seriously fucking doubt that. Johnny. This was the part that I always loved the most, the look of utter shock on these assholes' faces when I first called them by their name. I'd seen it dozens of times before, and it never grew old. Now, for the next part, he'll be rocked back for a few seconds before trying to reassert his authority. Wait, what? How did you know? I didn't let him finish his question. Johnny muttoned. Pedophile, rapist, and child killer. We've been tracking you for a while. Damn, he looked stupid, still dangling those cuffs in front of him. Guess what? We found you. Just watching the cogs of a regular human's brain slowly turn was not my favorite part of this whole game, though. See, Mun, work it out already. Then you can pretend it doesn't matter, that you're the boss here, and we can get down to business. Well, I don't give a fuck what you think you know. Oh, good, the bravado had returned. It was always more fun when they still thought they had the upper hand. I'm still going to torture you, rape you, and then leave little pieces of you scattered all over this forest. Again, with the dangling handcuffs. What was wrong with this shit? Which hand should we start with? You want my left? The fucking schmuck had a look on his face like it was Christmas and his birthday all rolled into one. He advanced and roughly placed the handcuff around my left wrist. Things are going to get real ugly now, little lady. He was smirking. He genuinely believed he was still in control. At least we can agree on something. Okay, jackass, let's get this over with. I was going to make this quick. This piece of shit wasn't even worth toying with. I grabbed the other end of the cuffs and clasped it around his wrist. There was no way he was going to escape me now. What are you doing, kid? You think that's... I jumped up and sank my fangs deep into his neck. I would feast on him later, but for now, ripping out half of his jugular would lead to a suitably painful death. I climbed off of him and spat out the chunk of flesh onto the ground in front of him. In his shocked state, he actually bent down and tried to pick it up, as though that would fix his lethal wound. I wasn't going to allow this sick bastard even that tiny crumb of false hope, though, and dragged him away into the middle of the clearing. Any last words, Johnny? This was a little cruel of me. What with the fact that this asshole was choking to death on his own blood. I didn't have much sympathy, though. He let out a pathetic gurgling sound, looking up at me pleadingly. Sorry, didn't catch that. But he was as white as a sheet now, and not long for this world time to monologue. You guys just don't put in the effort anymore. I mean, for fuck's sake, I only got into town last night. I was obviously indisposed during the daylight hours, meaning I know you had zero time to prep this. Dan, I remember the old days when sick fucks, like you would at least put in the effort. You know, a couple of weeks of following your victim, regular drive-bys, watching the home through binoculars, learning the names of friends. But you just spotted me and decided there and then to act on your impulses. Fucking pathetic. It didn't even occur to you how dumb it would be for a girl to be walking through the woods on her own. It took me less than 2 minutes to lure you in here. His breathing was extremely labored now. He had moments left. Okay, fair enough. Nobody expects one of our kind to look the way I do. But hey, like I said, you should have put in the legwork. Goodbye, Johnny. And with that, I decided to feast. It always tastes better when they're still alive, even if only just. In the quaint, isolated town of Autumnvale, nestled deep in the woods, far from prying eyes, stood an old, decrepit house that had been in my family for generations. This house was more than just a structure. It was a living testament to a lineage steeped in mystery and silence. To the untrained eye, it was just another relic of bygone days, its crumbling facade and sagging roof a mere curiosity for passing hikers. But to me, it was the keeper of my darkest secrets, a silent witness to unspeakable acts. The house had once been a majestic sight, a sprawling Victorian mansion built by my great-great-grandfather, a man of considerable wealth and somewhat dubious morality. Its walls were thick and imposing, designed to withstand the harshest elements, or perhaps to conceal the secrets within. The exterior, once painted a cheerful yellow, had long since faded to a sickly, mottled gray, the paint peeling in long, curling strips. The windows, tall and narrow, were clouded with grime, their wooden frames rotting and splintered. Ivy and moss crept up the walls, choking the life from the ancient stones, and adding to the air of neglect and decay. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of shadowy corridors and cavernous rooms, filled with relics from its halcyon days. The grand foyer, with its sweeping staircase and ornate chandelier, had long since lost its luster. The chandelier's crystals were coated in thick dust, and the staircase's banister was sticky with the residue of years of humidity and neglect. The wallpaper, once vibrant with intricate patterns, now hung in tattered strips, revealing the bare, splintered wood beneath. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed by human touch for years, and the floorboards groaned underfoot, their protests echoing through the silent halls. The air inside was thick and oppressive, and there was a miasma of mildew and decay that clung to my skin and filled my lungs with each breath. The scent was a constant reminder of the house's age and the secrets it held. Every creak and groan seemed amplified in the silence, each sound a ghostly reminder of the house's sinister history. The true heart of the house, though, lay beneath it. Hidden behind a heavy oak door that was always locked, the entrance to the cellar was a place I avoided unless absolutely necessary. The cellar was a place of perpetual darkness, where the cold seemed to seep into your very bones, and the silence itself was a living, breathing entity. At the far end, concealed behind a stack of forgotten crates and cobweb-covered shelves, was the well. This ancient construct, with its stone walls slick with moss and moisture, was a gaping maw that exuded a chill unlike anything else. It was a seemingly bottomless pit that had swallowed my darkest deeds without a trace. The well was not just a physical presence, however, it was a constant source of fear and dread, a silent sentry that watched over me my entire life. In the quiet moments of the night, when the wind whispered through the trees and the house settled with ghostly creaks, I could hear it calling to me. The whispers of my past, the voices of those I had sent to its depths, echoed in my mind, driving me to the brink of madness. The well was both my confessor and my judge, its dark influence ever present, a reminder of the darkness that lurked within me. Over the years, the house became my prison, the well my tormentor. I would wander its halls, haunted by memories of the lives I had taken, each room a reminder of the irreversible choices I had made. My old, decrepit house, far from being a mere relic of bygone days, was a living, breathing entity, its decaying walls and shadowy corners home to the darkest chapters of my life. My earliest memory is not of joy or innocence, but of my younger sister's incessant wailing. Her cries echoed through the dusty halls, piercing my young mind like a relentless drill. One sweltering summer day, as her shrill voice grated on my nerves, something inside me snapped. I was only 10 years old, but in that moment, consumed by a rage I couldn't comprehend, I silenced her forever. With trembling hands, I carried her lifeless body to the well in the cellar. The ancient stones, covered in moss and ivy, seemed to whisper my sins as I lifted the heavy lid. I dropped her into the cold, dark abyss, expecting the guilt to swallow me whole. But the next day, when I nervously peered into the well, her body was gone. The town searched for her, of course. They combed the woods and dredged the nearby river, but she had vanished without a trace. Eventually, they concluded she had wandered off and met a tragic fate, and the town mourned a lost child. As for me, I felt an odd mix of relief and confusion. The well had taken her, and in doing so, it had granted me a twisted absolution. Years passed, but the memory of that day never faded. The well remained a silent witness to my crime and a dark secret that only I knew. I told myself it was a one-time aberration, a moment of madness. But deep down, I knew something darker lay dormant within me, waiting to be unleashed again. It was a sweltering summer afternoon, 5 years after my sister's disappearance, when the well demanded its next offering. I was a teenager by this point, navigating the volatile years of adolescence with a simmering anger that I struggled to control. That day, I was with my friend Tommy, a boy whose boisterous laughter and relentless teasing had grated on my nerves for years. We were in the woods behind my house, near the outside entrance to the basement, and the well that had become both a source of dread and dark fascination for me. The sun beat down on us, the heat amplifying every irritation. We were playing a game that quickly turned into a heated argument. Tommy mocked me, pushing all the wrong buttons, and before I knew it, the world around me turned red. In a blind fury, I lashed out. My hands found a heavy branch, and with one swift, brutal swing, I struck him. The force of the blow was sickening, the crunch of bone, and the sudden silence more deafening than his taunts. Tommy crumpled to the ground, his body limp and lifeless. Panic surged through me, but alongside it was the cold, calculating part of my mind that now took over. I knew what I had to do. My hands shook as I dragged his body into the basement and over to the well, the same well that had swallowed my sister all those years ago. The stone rim felt like the edge of an abyss, the darkness below an all-consuming void. With a final desperate heave, I pushed Tommy's body into the well. I watched as it disappeared into the shadows, the sound of the splash echoing in the silence. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of my actions pressing down on me. I spent the night in a restless, feverish sleep, haunted by visions of Tommy's lifeless eyes. The next morning, Driven by a morbid curiosity and a sliver of hope, I returned to the well. As I peered into its depths, my breath caught in my throat. Tommy's body was gone. The well had taken him, just as it had taken my sister. The ground around the well was undisturbed, and there was no trace of the horror that had transpired the day before. A strange sense of relief washed over me. The well had once again erased my sin, concealing my darkest deed. But with that relief came a chilling realization. The well's power was real, and it was now a part of me, a dark shadow that would follow me for the rest of my life. The years rolled by, and I grew into adulthood with the well's dark secret, ever present in the back of my mind. Life moved on. I finished school, found a job, and even tried to lead a normal life. But the well's shadow never left me. I knew its terrible power, and a part of me feared that one day I might need to use it again. One fateful night, 10 years after young Tommy's disappearance, I found myself at a local bar, drowning my sorrows in a sea of alcohol. I met Rachel, a beautiful but equally inebriated woman. We bonded over our mutual loneliness and spent the night together. A few weeks later, she called me with news that shattered my fragile sense of normalcy. She was pregnant. Panic set in. I wasn't ready for the responsibility of fatherhood, and Rachel was adamant about keeping the baby. The fear of being trapped in a life I didn't want started to consume me, and in a moment of drunken despair, I decided to solve the problem the only way I knew how. I lured her to the woods, near the basement entrance to the well, and ended her life with a cold, calculated precision that terrified me. The next morning her body, like all the others, was gone, swallowed by the well's insatiable darkness. Years turned into decades, and the well's secret remained hidden. 15 years later, I found myself in the corporate world, working under a boss who was a tyrant. He made my life miserable, his constant belittling and impossible demands driving me to the brink. One day, after yet another humiliating public dressing down, something inside me snapped. I followed him home, confronting him in the parking lot of his apartment complex. The rage that had been simmering for years erupted, and I attacked him, my hands finding a steel pipe left carelessly in the shadows. The deed was done quickly, almost too easily. I transported his body to the well, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. As always, the next day, his body had vanished, and I was free from his torment. It was now 20 years after my sister's death, and the well had claimed 4 lives. More importantly, each time it had erased my sins, allowing me to carry on with my life as though nothing had happened. But the darkness within me grew with each act, and I became increasingly isolated, haunted by the faces of those I had sacrificed to the well. Then came the day my mother, now elderly and frail, became too much for me to handle. She had been my one faithful companion all these years, the one who had shared our home without sharing the burden of my dark secrets. She'd always been surprisingly strong for a woman her size, able to perform tasks you would never expect from such a demure frame. But now she needed constant care, and the cost of putting her in a home was more than I was willing to pay. The solution seemed clear, a twisted logic driven by years of getting away with murder. One night, I slipped into her room and ended her suffering. This time, as I dragged her to the well, a strange sense of unease settled over me. The familiar process felt somehow different, and I was tainted by a deeper, more personal guilt. I pushed her body into the well and walked away, expecting the well to do what it had always done. A sense of tranquility encased the park, embracing the quietude of the overcast day. The playground, during the summer months so filled with the laughter of children, now stood in near solitude. The sparse scattering of leaves, adorned in the rich hues of late autumn, embarked on a whimsical dance across the grassy expanse, propelled by the brisk and capricious wind. In the corner, the aged merry-go-round, covered in a coat of rust, groaned to life, its movement echoing through the quiet surroundings. An empty swing, bereft of the joyful giggles that so often accompanied its motion, swayed hesitantly, producing a haunting whine with each oscillation. The atmosphere, tinged with an unspoken melancholy, retained the remnants of youthful joy, albeit now faded into a poignant stillness. All these things went unnoticed by the man, a somewhat portly figure with thinning hair, the subtle nuances of the park's desolation unfolding around him. Oblivious to the vacant merry-go-round and the empty sandpit, he was engrossed in the simple act of pushing the swing that cradled his precious young girl. The little girl, donned in a pink coat adorned with a profusion of colorful flowers, swung steadily back and forth, caught in a melody woven by his lullaby. His gentle song resonated in the crisp air, carried away by the wind that swept through the quiet expanse of the deserted park. The man, lost in the rhythm of his paternal duty, remained blissfully unaware of the tender echoes of solitude that surrounded their seemingly intimate moment. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word. Daddy's gonna buy you a mockingbird." Just then, in a haunting juxtaposition to the tranquil scene playing out before them, a single newspaper page, carried by a gust of wind, pirouetted through the air, eventually coming to rest on the ground at the man's feet. The headline that graced the front page carried an emotional plea: "Bring Claire home." The image accompanying the plea portrayed a young girl, Claire, mirroring the age and appearance of the girl on the swing, adorned as she was in a pink coat embellished with a myriad of vibrant flowers. The man noticed the newspaper page, meeting the paper's headline with cold eyes and a sadistic smile. The serenity of the park was then shattered, as the front of Claire's coat became stained with blood. The thread sound to hold Claire's lips, shut stretched under the strain. Blood then flowed from the needle holes as the skin tore and the thread ripped. Her scream would be heard by nobody other than her captor. "I try to live my life without too many regrets. I've had highs and lows like everyone else, sure, but I do what I can not to worry too much about what could have happened if I'd made a different choice, if I maybe hadn't taken the road less traveled. I figure everyone makes the best decisions they can with the information they have available to them at the time. Going through all the what-ifs is ridiculous, because the only way you would have made a different choice is if you'd had some other detail, which of course you didn't. Hindsight is perfect, and even then, you can never be sure exactly what the sequence of events might have looked like if you'd gone right instead of left. And yet, there is one choice I made, one road I took, that I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I'd only done something different. My job has me move around pretty regularly. I'm not going to get into what I do. It has no bearing on the story. But a couple years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and since this was the closest I'd been to home since I'd moved out to college, I took the chance to go see my parents whenever I could. I knew I'd be moving again before long, and my folks aren't getting any younger, so I tried to find a weekend every month, or so, to make the 7-hour trip to visit them. If I'd been thinking about it when I was looking for places to rent, I'd have probably tried to live on the west side of Philadelphia, instead of in Jersey to avoid the traffic during rush hour. But by the time I realized it, the lease was signed and there wasn't much I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring, honestly. I'd take the Ben Franklin Bridge across the river, head up I-4 and 76 for an hour or so, then embark on a long slog across basically the entire expanse of PA on I-80 before another hour north on I-79 to Erie, Pennsylvania, where I'm from. The only variance in the drive was how long it would take me to get through Philly, because once I got on the 4076 extension, I could typically predict my ETA within 5 or 10 minutes. For my second summer in Jersey, I'd taken 2 weeks off and planned on spending the second week in Erie. Things changed that first Wednesday, though, because a big storm blew through and knocked out power in a good part of the area where I was living. Dealing with 90-degree heat with no air conditioning wasn't something I particularly felt like spending the first half of my vacation doing. So after one uncomfortably sweaty night, I let my parents know I'd be heading over a few days early. In retrospect, I should have left first thing in the morning. But because I had a couple things to take care of before heading out, by the time I finally got on the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime and getting on toward mid-afternoon. For whatever reason, the traffic in Philly was particularly heavy, and by the time I finally got through town, I was a good hour behind schedule. Still, based on my normal timeline, I figured I'd still be able to make it in early enough to grab a dinner and beer with my dad and brother before cashing in for the night. Two things I hadn't taken into consideration were the number of other folks that, apparently, had the same idea to get out of town that I did, and the road construction that must have sprung up in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a heck of a thing. Being able to zip along at 65, 70, or in some remote places like West Texas, even faster, makes cross-country automobile travel take a fraction of the hours it would otherwise. I can't tell you the number of times my folks have reminisced about the days before the interstate, when going to see friends outside of DC would take almost twice as long as it does now. What's truly remarkable to me, though, is that even though the entire system of highways was built start to finish in a mere 35 years, it sure seems like, when parts of it go under construction, they stay that way forever. Traffic was uncharacteristically heavy, but moving. I was making decent time until I saw the first orange warning signs, letting me know that our 4 lanes were reducing to 3, and then 2, and then 1. Hundreds of cones stretched down the road as far as the eye could see. And see I certainly could as the cars in front of me reached a complete and total standstill. It was one of the worst deadlocks I've ever been in. Seriously, I think I moved a mile in an hour. After about 3 hours, my stomach started grumbling. With an exit just ahead, and no end to the traffic jam in sight, I got off and found a diner to grab some dinner. Even if traffic miraculously picked up, I still had a solid 5 hours of driving ahead of me, so at that point, I knew for sure it was going to be pretty late that I was getting in. After finishing eating, I got back on the road. Things looked like they were picking up for a couple miles. But then I came up to the back end of the jam and was right back to waiting. We were moving a little bit better, I think averaging about 5 miles an hour at this point. But as the sun started edging toward the horizon, I pulled out my phone and started to see if Google Maps could clue me in on any kind of workaround. It's a funny thing about human nature. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports have showed that people would rather walk farther to baggage claim to get their luggage, even if the total time would have been less if they'd have had a slightly longer wait at planeside. Well, the power of the internet appeared to be in my favor, though I-80 still showed as a dark red band for another 50 miles or so. There was a southbound county road coming up in just a few miles, and a northbound a couple after that, either of which looked they'd let me bypass the worst of the traffic. Since I'd spent the better part of the day sitting on the road, my patience was about worn out. I opted to take the southbound road, even though the app told me it would ultimately take about 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house. I just wanted to get moving again, and reasoned that at this rate, it might take me more than the 30-minute difference to get to the northbound route anyway. And that is a choice that will haunt me until the day I die. I made the turnoff and immediately felt my mood improve. The signs alternated, limiting my speed between 35 and 40 miles an hour, but even that seemed like flying compared to the logjam I'd spent the last several hours in. The drive was interesting. The road started a little twisty, with plenty of elevation changes as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It took me on a general southwest diagonal, but turned and doubled back on itself enough that for the first 30 minutes or so, I got regular views of the stalled traffic on I-80. Pretty soon after that, though, just about the time that the sun was dipping down beneath a couple hills in my rearview mirror, the road took a long curving tack and carried me down a way, out of sight of the interstate. Now, something that a lot of people don't realize is how big of a state Pennsylvania is. Sure, there are plenty of bigger ones, but PA is deceptively big. And it is remote. Isolated. Hell, the translation of the name means Penn's Woods. After all, the Blair Witch Project didn't have to embellish that aspect of the state. The fact that you could head into the woods and walk for dozens of miles in any direction without seeing anything like another human being. It's got a decent number of big cities. Pittsburgh and Philly both have enough of a population to support major sports teams. But away from those centers of development, the Harrisburgs and the Pottsvilles and the Scrantons and what have you, there's a whole lot of nothing. Nothing and trees, and dark and lonely road. Such was the road I was traveling that night, winding through the twists and turns of the Appalachian foothills. I've moved around a lot. I mentioned traveled through most of the continental states. Anyway, I sometimes used to wonder, when I'd be driving along a patch of asphalt surrounded by only untamed wilderness, what it must have been like to construct such a road. What had it been like before men had intruded with our civilization and our machines? What had lived there? I don't wonder anymore. Not since that night when I went left instead of right. The way continued to twist back and forth, up and down. As I wound deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, branches from either side of the road reaching over and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet up that blocked out much of my view of the sky and the stars above. I drove with my high beams on, because the idea of streetlights had never entered the minds of whoever built this road. The painted lines were old and not well cared for, and I found myself gradually straddling the faded double yellow partition running down the middle of the two lanes to keep some distance between myself and the trees that increasingly encroached the pavement's edge. I've never been a particularly good navigator. My parents used to say it was because I spent my childhood with my nose pushed into a book during car rides, but I personally just think it's because I'm bad at it. So, honey together. despite there being no possible way I could be lost, as there were no other roads I could have possibly turned onto and gotten off track. I more and more frequently found myself checking my phone to ensure I was still on the right path, which is how I almost ran into the other car. My mind was wandering, thinking about the fact that my signal bars had dropped and remained at 0 for the last 20 minutes, and what possible implications that would mean if I should have some kind of emergency. I raised my eyes back to the road after Google Maps confirmed for probably the 20th time I was still good on my route choice, and after my brain took a beat to process that what I was rapidly approaching was a vehicle, stopped in the middle of the lane and slammed my foot on the brake. I stopped in time, but not by much, with maybe 5 feet separating my hood from the other car's rear bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my body, but my fear quickly gave way to anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only was he stopped in the middle of the road, but all his lights were off. If I hadn't had my high beams on, there was a good chance I wouldn't have seen him before I was practically on top of him. Even if I hadn't been checking my phone, I could feel my pulse beating in the vein on the side of my neck. I'm not somebody particularly prone to road rage, and after a couple quick breaths, I managed to get a hold of myself. Not wanting to outright alarm anyone that might still be in the vehicle, I shifted into reverse and backed up about 20 feet, popping my hazards on. That was when I started noticing a few odd things about the stopped car, more than just the fact that the lights were out. Of course, it was halted directly in the middle of the road, but that wasn't unreasonable, since there wasn't any shoulder to speak of that the driver could have moved it over to. The strange thing, though, was that all the doors were open, those on the driver's side even crossing over slightly into the oncoming lane. And upon further observation, I saw an item dropped out onto the road by the rear driver's side door, something that appeared to be a child's stuffed animal. I considered my options, and, after a few seconds, decided that I would have to go against my better judgment, keep on my merry way, and head outside to get a better idea of what was going on. I said earlier that my job doesn't have anything to do with this story, which is mostly true. But before you judge my decisions too harshly, it bears mentioning that I've spent some time in the military. An obligation to help people has been drilled into me over the years, and I'd seen enough things while deployed to feel that I could handle myself. And so, I got out of my car, but kept it running. I popped the trunk to grab the flashlight I keep there and left my headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to spy signs of other cars approaching, but no luck. "Hello." I called up to the other car as I cautiously started my approach, circling around to the left toward the middle of the road so I'd be able to get a look inside before I got too close. "Anyone there?" No answer. The beams from my headlights helped some, but there were still enough shadows to obscure the car's interior. Shining my flashlight, easily determined that no one was inside, though. I moved closer, stooping down by the rear door to pick up the fallen object off the ground. It was a child's toy, just as I had suspected, a stuffed rabbit with worn patches showing signs of frequent love. I frowned. If the folks traveling in the car had hitched a ride with a passerby, they would have taken the rabbit, or the kid would have thrown a conniption. I shut the rear door and moved up to the front. I put my hand on the hood and found it was still warm to the touch. That meant it couldn't have been here terribly long. I slid into the driver's seat to try and figure out if there were some kind of mechanical issue that would have forced the car to stop, and was startled to find a set of keys still dangling from the ignition. Pressing the brake, I turned the key and the engine started right up, headlights and the dome light in the roof springing to life. Fuel oil, temperature, battery, all the gauges looked good, not even a check engine light. Curiouser and curiouser. Then I saw the purse in the passenger seat. I picked it up, a normal brown shoulder bag, and briefly rummaged around before finding a wallet inside. Everything appeared to be intact. It had about $40 in cash, a couple credit cards, a gym membership, and a Sam's Club card. The driver's license named the owner as Mary Walker, a pretty blonde that had just turned 30 the month before. A couple pictures showed Mary in staged poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree, the leaves of which were red and yellow, captured in the thrall of autumn. A huge, bearded lumberjack of a man hugged her from behind, a small pony-tailed girl with a goofy, over-exaggerated smile on her lap. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a shiver running down to the base of my spine. Something was very wrong with this situation. I put everything back in the purse and returned it to the seat, turned off the car, and got out, shutting the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, holding it over my head to try and get a connection. No luck. Cursing softly, I jammed the red end call button and moved around to the passenger side of the car. I played my flashlight around and noticed that some of the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled, like someone had walked through it. I didn't have enough woodcraft to be able to judge how long ago they might have passed, but even then, I couldn't imagine any scenario for why they would have gone wandering. Shining my light into the woods, the beam only extended maybe 30 feet through the trees before being effectively swallowed by the greedy blackness. Looking at the flattened foliage, at the stuffed rabbit in my hand, then at that dark trees crowding maliciously, my thoughts teetered back and forth between what I should do. I made up my mind. I'd been trained to help people. It was hardwired into my system. There was a child somewhere in the woods. I raised my foot to take a step onto the beaten path. That's when a white flicker of movement entered the very edge of my flashlight beam. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally, her arms swaying out of sync with the rest of her body, like a marionette manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. "Hello," her voice called out. "Anyone there?" More shapes came into view behind her, shambling along. Here the bearded man who must be Mary's husband, there her little daughter, owner of the well-loved rabbit, both naked, both moving as oddly as their wife and mother. And now I could tell there were more. Many more, their forms indistinct out of the direct light, but so many, they caused the darkness to pitch and swell with their odd, staggering passage, their voices a chorus. "Hello?" they called. "Anyone there?" Parroting back the questions I'd asked only a few short minutes ago when I'd approached the abandoned car. I took a stumbling step back, away from the woods and the approaching automatons, tripping into the walker's car. Catching my balance, I involuntarily shone my light up into the pitch recesses of the branches, and in doing so, could just make out, barely, a sort of darkness crouched hidden in the upper limits, a void even darker than the trees. Was it my imagination? Those lines of pure blackness that extended from that concealed mass and seemed to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker, her kin, and the countless other shapes moving in concert with them. "Hello. Anyone there?" I sprinted then, back to my car, engine mercifully still running, headlights and hazards flashing welcomingly. Hello. I shifted to reverse, miraculously keeping enough of my head to avoid running off the road as I completed a 3-point turn. Anyone there? I chanced a glance in my rearview mirror. The pale form of Mary Walker stood halted just at the edge of the forest, where the trees met the road. One hand was raised, beckoning me to return, or perhaps waving goodbye. Her face a mask of confused sadness. I pressed the gas and drove back the way I came. I did not look back again. The rest of the trip was a fog. At some point after I made it back to the interstate, I called my parents, letting them know I wouldn't be getting in until late. I drove on autopilot, the traffic jam having cleared while I was off. I thought about calling 911, but didn't. What would I have told them? And to what end? There was no one left to be helped. I try not to go through life with too many regrets, wondering about what ifs. But this choice. What if I had left earlier in the day? What if I hadn't stopped for dinner? Maybe I would have still gone left. Maybe I would have been there in time to help the walkers. Maybe I would have been taken by that black thing fishing in the dark. What if I had gone right? Would I still be ignorantly going through life, unknowing there are other things out there? I try not to think of it too often, but every now and then, my thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I reached my parents' house that night that I realized I still had it clutched in my hand. I used to wonder, before men brought our roads and civilization, what was the wilderness like? What lived there? I don't wonder anymore. I can't afford to, at least if I don't want to wake up screaming. And no matter how bad the traffic, I always stick to the interstate. The hike was long, nearly 6 miles. The first 5 were easy enough, but the last mile was a series of constant switchbacks on a steep slope that left me gasping for air with each step. We were exhausted and drenched in sweat, but in good spirits when we finally arrived at the top of the ridge shortly before sunset. My friends seemed eager to explore the nearby landscape, and I shared their enthusiasm. From what we had heard, the view here was stunning. It was our annual summer camping trip, a rigid tradition that had endured since childhood. My family, and the families of my 3 best friends, who also happened to be my neighbors, spent a week in this park every summer. It was a serene environment that allowed one to shed their stress, their worries, and all the troubles of the previous year. Here, next to the sprawling forests of pines, and under the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, we came to forget the problems of life and simply enjoyed ourselves. I had many fond memories of this place that spanned throughout my childhood. Fishing and swimming in lakes, marshmallows, and ghost stories over the campfire. Hiking along the many trails that covered the park. I looked forward to this trip each and every year. However, this year was slightly different. Our families had stayed at the usual campgrounds while Tony, Astor, Margaret, and I hiked onward to a different area. For many years, we had been told that there was a campground on top of a ridge that offered an absolute incredible view of the valley below. On more than a few occasions, my friends and I had begged our parents to take us there, but we could never convince them to make the long hike. For our younger siblings, 6 miles was simply too far to walk. At least, that was the excuse they used. Nevertheless, we had collectively convinced our parents to allow us to make the hike alone this year. They had agreed that we were definitely old enough to camp out on our own, and wished us well on our journey. Here we were, 5 hours later, on top of the heavily forested ridge and excited to pitch our tents. As soon as we reached the top of the ridge, The dirt path leveled off. There were pine trees on either side of the path that cast long shadows in the evening sun. About 100 yards ahead, the other edge of the ridge could be seen, and we picked up our pace in anticipation of the view. I noticed that there was a small building at the edge of the path that was built very close to the cliff. It looked like a house, and I curiously wondered who would be living up here. Turning my mind back towards the reason we were here, I hurried past the house with my friends and arrived at the opposite end of the ridge. The view was everything we had anticipated. The setting sun illuminated the valley below us. The August grass shone gold and waved with the light breeze that swept through the valley. A few wisps of clouds gently floated through the sky and were illuminated red by the dying beams of sunlight. I heard Astor and Margaret gasp in awe as they admired the landscape. Tony and I stood in silent appreciation, taking in the beauty. We must have stood there for close to 10 minutes as the sun sank ever lower towards the horizon. We were so hypnotized that we failed to notice the man behind us. As soon as I turned around, I saw him. An old man, he looked perhaps 70, and he sat in a chair, smoking a cigarette on the porch of the building I had seen earlier. He was looking at us with an amused expression on his face as he puffed away. Feeling a little embarrassed that all four of us had walked past him without so much as saying, "Good evening," I decided to approach him and introduce myself. His eyes locked on me as I walked up to his front porch. "Good evening," I said in a friendly tone. "Damn right it is," the old man immediately responded, taking another drag on his cigarette. I was a little startled by his forwardness, but I smiled and introduced myself. "My name's Chris Harding," I said as I extended a hand to him. The old man pulled a tobacco-stained hand out of his right pocket and gave me a good, firm handshake. Walter McNeil," he said with a smile. "And these are my friends, Astor, Tony, and Margaret," I said, pointing to each of them. "Sorry for not noticing you earlier." Walter waved his hand in a dismissive manner. "He's all right. That view is a lot prettier than me," he chuckled. My friends and I chuckled along with him. I liked his sense of humor. We've never been up here before, and we didn't know anybody had a house up here. "What makes you live here?" I asked. Walter held out his hand, palm upwards, pointing towards the scenery behind us. His eyebrows were raised in amusement. I immediately felt incredibly stupid for asking such a question. "Oh, yeah, that's some view, isn't it?" I said. "It is, ain't it? Best time of the whole damn year, actually. You wouldn't want to be here in January. Winters are something fierce," he stated. "Do you live here alone?" Just me. Been here my whole life and I don't ever plan on moving." "So you grew up around here?" "Sure did. Used to be a little town down in that valley. That's where I was born and raised." "What happened to it?" I inquired. "The town. Why isn't it there anymore?" "Well, nothing happened to it so much as it just withered away. All the young folk of my time moved on. Didn't want to live their lives in a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere," Walter said, with a touch of sadness in his voice. "But not you. You didn't want to go anywhere." "No, not me. Perfectly happy to be here till I'm dead." Walter said nothing further and seemed to go into deep thought. We stood around awkwardly for close to a minute before finally deciding to say goodbye and head to the camping area. We were tired from our hike and needed to pitch our tents and sleep. "Excuse me," I said, waking Walter from his silent contemplations. "How do we get to the campgrounds from here?" The campgrounds. Oh, just follow that trail there for about half a mile. It goes along the ridge, and it'll lead you straight to a clearing where you can set up camp. You'll have the place all to yourselves. Hardly anybody comes up here anymore." Walter pointed to the right of his house, and our eyes followed his finger. There was a thin dirt path leading into the trees. "Okay, thanks for your help, Mr. McNeil," I said. We waved goodbye to him and started to turn towards the trail. Just as my head turned away from the house, something caught my eye. It was another trail, even thinner, that led into the trees on the left side of the house. "Where does that trail lead?" I asked, nodding my head towards the other path. Walter glanced over towards it, and a smile crept onto his lips. He took a drag on his cigarette and responded. "Oh, that trail. It leads to the stairway," he said casually. "The what?" "The stairway. That's what everyone calls it. I don't think it has a proper name." "What's the stairway?" I inquired, genuinely curious. "It's the damn strangest thing I ever saw. Just a set o' stairs, carved out o' rock. Goes right out o' the cliff. Been there just about forever." "What?" I said incredulously. "At a stairway made out of rock, right over the cliff?" "Aye, exactly that. You gotta see it to believe it, but it's there." "Who built it?" "Why would anyone build something like that?" "Well, about 10 years ago, these archaeologists come up here to look at it. They got a load o' fancy tools, nevin' such. One of them tells me that it's nearly 900 years old, if you can believe it. So I guess the Injuns must have built it. There sure as hell wasn't anybody else here 900 years ago." "I see. Why did the Native Americans build it?" I asked. "Ain't nobody got a clue. Hell, those archaeologists couldn't even tell how they built it. Said it looked like the staircase was carved straight out of the rock, but the way it sticks over the side of the ridge, there couldn't have been any mountain to carve it out of. In fact, it's a damned miracle it hasn't fallen over. Shouldn't even be standing, with how it is." Walter explained. "At least, that's what the archaeologists say." The way he emphasized the word, "archaeologists," made it clear that Walter was not telling the full story and was merely waiting for us to ask him to elaborate. I decided to humor him. After all, he clearly didn't get many visitors. What do other people say? Walter's face lit up in honest excitement as he was given the opportunity to tell a story. His cigarette was nearly gone, and he threw the butt on the ground and pulled a new one from his pocket. As he lit it with a match, he looked at us and asked, "You kids like ghost stories?" "Sure, we love ghost stories," Astor exclaimed. The rest of us nodded in agreement. Many ghost stories had been swapped between our families over a campfire, and a fresh one was always welcome. "Well, pull up your pants and get ready, 'cause I got one haluva story for you," Walter said as he puffed his new cigarette. "So there's this God, you see. It rules over this land, and..." "Is this a Native American legend?" Margaret cut him off. "To tell you the truth, miss, I don't know. Very well could be, but I don't got a clue where it came from. This is just a story I heard as a boy. Jimmy Dwight's granddad used to tell it when he was drunk as hell and couldn't keep his old mouth shut." Walter laughed hard, and his laughter turned into a wheeze, which turned into a coughing fit that lasted several minutes. When he had finally composed himself, he continued with the story. "So anyways, there's a God that rules over this land. And he's got these spirits under his command. And these spirits, they got a job. When somebody is close to death, when their time has come, so to speak, these spirits go to the dying man and they help him along. They take him and show him the way to the next life. So they're good spirits, you see. They help people go peacefully. Walter ruminated for a moment. It looked as if he was having trouble remembering the story. So, anyways, what was I saying? Oh yeah, there's the good spirits that take dying people away. Except, one of these spirits was actually no good. He didn't do his job right. He liked it when people died, you see. There was something about it, something about death he liked. So he starts taking people when it ain't their time. Healthy people, young people, people that got no business dying. And this bad spirit, he's killing them. Just for the sake of killing. Ain't that awful? Yeah, sounds real bad. Tony agreed. This mean spirit, he goes around killing people for no good reason. And the killing seems to give him power. Makes him stronger. So the god figures that this can't go on any longer. So he banishes him. The bad spirit gets thrown out of God's realm. Heaven you could call it. He lands on his ass, right in this area, and most of his power is gone too. But not all. So the evil spirit is still here, roaming around. Is that it? Astor asked. You're ahead o' me, young lady, Walter responded. As I said, most of the bad spirit's power is gone, but not all. He's still got some juice left. And like I said, killing makes him stronger, so he keeps on killing. 'Cept he doesn't bother with individuals no more. That ain't no fun. He likes groups o' people. Groups he can play with. He taunts him, like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it. And the more the people suffer before they die, the more power he gets. And what does he use his power for, you ask? Well, he uses it to build that damned stairway. Every time he does some poor group of people in, he heads on over to that stairway and uses the power to add an extra step to it. In fact, it's his power that keeps the stairway from falling over. He's been building that stairway for close to 1,000 years. He's a patient little bastard. He's building it upwards so that one day he can get back to heaven and have his revenge. Walter laughed hard again, but thankfully his laughter did not degenerate into another coughing fit. How's that for a stairway to heaven? I chuckled at the reference to the song, but I was also impressed by Walter's story. It certainly was a rather creepy tale. It seemed perfectly tailored to scare them. An evil spirit roaming these lands, only preying on groups of people such as themselves. An excellent ghost story. And how many steps are on this stairway now? How many groups have come up here and met with a terrible fate? I asked with an amused tone. There's... Walter trailed off. Well, I'll be damned if I haven't forgot. I went out on that stairway when I was young and counted the steps. But that was so long ago. I can't remember at all how many steps there are. Of course, you're free to go and find out. Walter's coy offer piqued my interest, and I found that it also interested my friends. He told us that the trail leading to the stairway was only a few hundred yards long, and that we would still have time to see it before the sun set. It didn't take much convincing to get us on the path to see the legendary set of stairs. My mouth hung open in shock. It was exactly as Walter had described it. Even so, I was still completely blown away by what I saw. A large staircase, made entirely of gray rock, jutting out over the edge of the ridge. It was steep and had no support as far as I could tell. It looked as if it should fall over at any second. I could tell that my friends were as amazed as I was. I had never seen anything like it in my life. Walter had understated when he called it the damn strangest thing he ever saw. We silently stared at the stone monstrosity for a long time. The sun was starting to touch the horizon when Tony spoke. How many? How many what? I responded. How many steps are there? Count them. I'm sure as hell not walking out on that thing. All four of us began counting the stone steps in our heads as the remaining rays of sunlight illuminated the stairway. I lost count once and had to start over. 39. Margaret declared. Tony and Astor agreed with her count. I was the last one to finish my tally of the stairs, and I arrived at the same conclusion. 39. I agreed. 39 groups of people, killed by the evil spirit that haunts these lands. Tony said in an overdone spooky voice. We laughed, and Astor mentioned that we should all tell our parents about this place as soon as the week was over. We had a great ghost story to share. The sun finally dipped below the horizon and left behind only a blood-red sky. We decided to head back towards Walter's house and take the path to the campground, promising ourselves that we would come back to see the stairway at least once before the week was over. The walk to the campground was fairly uneventful. We saw Walter again as we passed by his house, and told him that there were 39 steps on the stairway. He mumbled something along the lines of, "Sounds 'bout right," before bidding us good night and heading into his house. It took less than 15 minutes to walk the half-mile path to the camping area. In the fading twilight, we chatted and did our best to spook each other with dreadful stories of the evil spirit that lurked in these woods. About halfway through the walk, Tony had spotted the dirty skeleton of a squirrel laying just off the path. Astor, the most squeamish member of our group, had been unwilling to so much as look at it, so Tony had picked up the skull and chased her with it, laughing as she let out angry cries of disgust. Margaret scolded him like a mother, warning him that he could get all sorts of diseases from animal carcasses, but Tony didn't seem to care. He chased Astor with the skull for most of the walk before finally tossing it on the ground and kicking it into the trees. It was these types of antics that I missed, and so dearly looked forward to each year as I camped with my friends. The campground was merely a clearing in the woods. It was uneven ground, a long and narrow scar in the woods that followed the high ridge we were upon. There were 3 fire pits lined up in a nice row, along with room for 3 groups to set up camp. We had the entire place to ourselves. We were seasoned experts at pitching tents, and Tony and I had a race against Astor and Margaret to see who could pitch their tents faster. Tony and I won by just a few seconds, and the girls cried foul because the ground beneath their tent was rockier and harder to drive a stake into. We all had a good laugh over it. The tent that Tony and I were using was closest to the trail, and Margaret and Astor's tent was directly opposite to ours, with a fire pit between us. In the cool night air, we built a bright campfire and cooked hot dogs on sticks, each taking turns coming up with new ghost stories. From the position of the moon, I could tell that it was easily past midnight when we finally decided to crawl into our tents and drift into sleep, exhausted from the long hike. The next day was wonderful. There were no clouds in the sky, and a gentle breeze swept through the trees, keeping us cool with the hot August sun above. We passed the time in bliss, exploring the nearby woods. Margaret stumbled upon a small, pretty stream not far from the camp, and we must have spent 2 hours sitting with our feet in the refreshing cold water. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to say anything. We were as content as we had ever been. The day, so far, had been perfect. Unfortunately, that perfection would not last. It was evening, and Tony was building the campfire. Margaret had gone into the woods to go to the bathroom, and Astor sat directly behind Tony, watching him toss wood into the fire. I had just entered our tent to retrieve the hot dogs for our evening meal when I heard Tony scream. It was a clear scream of pain that echoed throughout the woods and jolted me upright. Rushing outside, I saw Tony laying on the ground next to the roaring fire. His cries of agony had ceased, and he now clutched his left hand to his chest, biting his lower lip and taking deep breaths. I could see that the side of his left hand, from his pinky finger to his wrist, was an angry shade of red and covered with blisters. I immediately knew that Tony had burned himself. As an experienced camper, I was accustomed to emergencies, and I quickly ran back into our tent. We had brought a first aid kit that included burn ointment. I was rummaging through my backpack, searching for the burn cream, when Tony began cussing. "Aster, what the fuck did you do that for?" Tony cursed. There was clear anger in his voice. What? I heard Astor stutter. Why the fuck did you push me?" I found the burn cream and some bandages and stepped outside the tent to see what the problem was. Tony's face had become red with rage, and Astor stood with a shocked expression on her face. Tony looked at me while pointing at Astor. "Chris, that bitch tried to push me into the fire." I was extremely confused by the accusation that Tony was making. I turned my head to look at Astor, who was pale with shock, then looked back at Tony. "Tony, what are you saying?" I asked as I walked over to him and bent down to apply ointment to his hand. I could see that there was no charring of the skin, which meant that the burns were only second degree. That was good. The hand would heal fully. She pushed me. She fucking pushed me towards the fire and I got burned. He hissed with venom in his voice. Tony winced as I wrapped a bandage around his hand. I was disturbed by what he was saying. Tony had always been the most level-headed member of our group. I did not understand why he was accusing Astor of hurting him. "You just fell down. You tripped and stuck your hand in the fire. That's all that happened," I said calmly. "Don't blame Astor. I was pushed. I felt it. Someone pushed me really hard, right in the back. I didn't fucking trip. I know someone pushed me. Margaret isn't here and you were in the tent, but Astor was right behind me the whole time. She definitely pushed me." I looked back at Astor and could tell that she was close to crying. I had known her since I was a toddler, and she was one of the sweetest people I had ever met. There was no way, absolutely no way, that she had tried to push Tony into the fire. Tony. Why would she do that? Why would Astor push you into a fire? Think about what you're saying, I rationalized. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe she's mad. Mad about the squirrel skull I chased her with? Yeah, she was mad about that and wanted revenge. Astor choked back a sob. Tony, I would never do that. Push you into a fire. That's horrible. I'm sorry about your hand, but yeah. Sorry that my head didn't go into the fire instead. Tony sneered back. I'm lucky I caught my balance and only touched some embers. I nearly lost my fucking face. Astor burst into tears and ran into her tent. I could hear her sobbing into her sleeping bag. Now I was angry, and I turned to Tony. What the hell is wrong with you? Why did you make Astor cry? I asked Tony in an angry tone. Back up. Shut up. Shut up and think about it. You've known Astor as long as I have. Have you ever seen her do something mean? Even once? Tony's face softened. His eyes fell down to the ground. Well, no, I haven't. But nothing. You're being ridiculous. Astor didn't push you into the fire. Nobody pushed you. You just fell. Go apologize to Astor for making her cry. Immediately. I had always been the strong voice of command in our group. Tony capitulated and went into the tent to apologize to Aster, but not before insisting that somebody had indeed pushed him into that fire. Margaret returned from the woods, and we filled her in on what happened to Tony. She suggested that we should cut our trip short and get him to a doctor, but Tony was completely against the idea. He insisted that the burn was not serious. The ointment and bandages kept his hand from hurting badly, and there was no point in ruining the trip, he said. And so, with Tony and Aster on good terms again, we fell asleep in our tents and spent another cool, pleasant night on the ridge. I awoke to screaming. Not a scream of pain, but a scream of fear. It was high and shrill, jolting me upright from a deep sleep. Even before I stepped out of my tent, I knew that it was Aster. Only she could produce such a sharp cry from her vocal cords. The sun had just begun to rise, sending fresh beams of sunlight through the trees. I warily stumbled out of the tent, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Our tents and the grass were covered with sparkling dew, but I had no time to admire the beauty of early morning. Becoming more alert, I noticed that Aster was standing in the entrance to her tent with her hands over her mouth. Margaret had been awakened by the sudden scream and stood behind her. Both of them looked down towards the ground in front of their tent. I followed their gaze and saw that something laid in the dirt. I walked around the fire pit towards the girls' tent in order to get a look at what had caused Aster to cry out. I approached the tent and focused on the object in the dirt. When I could clearly see what it was, I recoiled in disgust. It was a squirrel's skull, and not just the skull, to be precise. The entire skeleton was there as well, laid out in a sickening pose that made it appear to be dancing. It looked exactly like the squirrel skeleton we had seen on the first night, except this skeleton was clean. Its bones were bright white and did not have a single speck of dirt on them, as if somebody had rigorously scrubbed each and every one, carefully making sure that any impurities were removed, leaving a shiny white pile of bones perfectly laid out in front of Aster's tent. Aster continued to gasp in horror and disgust as Tony stepped out of our tent and walked towards us with a concerned look on his face. "What's wrong? What's going on?" he asked. Aster wrenched her gaze from the skeleton and looked at Tony as he approached. The expression on her face turned from terror to anger. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Aster screamed hysterically. "As if you don't fucking know." Tony looked confused. He stood next to me and peered down at the ground, seeing the skeleton for the first time. "You're such a fucking a-shole, Tony. I thought we made up last night. You said you were sorry for blaming me. What a fucking liar. Fuck you." I absolutely agreed with Aster. It was one thing for Tony to be paranoid and believe that he had been pushed into the fire, but now he had taken things too far. Taking the squirrel skeleton that he had tormented Aster with earlier and placing it outside her tent was cruel. It seemed clear to everyone that he had done so in a petty attempt to exact revenge for the perceived assault Aster had committed. I became angry, extremely angry. I turned to Tony. I was about to tell him off, to go on a tirade against him, to cuss him out for being such a thoughtless, paranoid asshole. I opened my mouth to begin my rant, and then immediately closed my lips and swallowed my words when I saw his face. He had taken a step backwards from the skeleton. His face had gone pale and his hands were clenched into tight fists. I could see the tension in his arms and neck. He was afraid. Truly, sincerely afraid. Aster continued to curse at Tony. After several moments he turned his wide eyes towards Aster and looked her in the face. All he could manage was a barely audible squeak. I didn't do this," Tony whispered as his voice cracked. "Oh, sure you didn't," Aster replied sarcastically. "No, that skeleton just walked up here on its own and sat itself down in front of my tent." "You're a lying ashhole. That's all you are. A lying ashhole." Aster ran back into her tent sobbing. Margaret said nothing and only scowled at Tony before returning to the tent to console Aster. And in that moment I became afraid. Tony was not lying. There was genuine fear etched across his face. He had not placed that skeleton outside of Aster and Margaret's tent. That I felt sure of. I sure as hell hadn't put the skeleton there. And Aster clearly didn't. She wouldn't so much as touch such a thing. That left only Margaret. But what motive did she have? She never liked practical jokes, and this had far exceeded what was appropriate for a joke. I knew Tony was having the same thoughts that I was. He turned towards me and opened his mouth, but before he could speak I shook my head and said, "Don't look at me. I didn't put it there." Tony's face grew whiter. He gave a short nod of understanding and went back to our tent, mumbling something about getting breakfast ready. I stepped into the girls' tent and tried to help calm Aster down. I told her that I honestly thought Tony hadn't put the skeleton there, but she could not be reasoned with. In between bouts of crying, she merely kept repeating, "Somebody put it there. Somebody put it there." The rest of the day went by without more incidents, but the damage had already been done. Aster refused to speak to Tony and hardly left the tent. Margaret again suggested that we cut the trip short. This time I agreed. I was unsettled, to say the least, and wanted nothing more than to get the hell away from this place. There was something going on here, something no good, and I did not care to find out what it was. That evening we ate our dinner in silence. Aster remained in her tent and spoke to only Margaret. Before the sun had set we were all in our tents, attempting to fall asleep. The plan was to wake at the crack of dawn, pack up our supplies, and leave. Nobody wanted to stay here any longer. As I laid in the tent next to Tony, wrapped in my sleeping bag, and waiting for sleep to take hold, my mind wandered in the manner that minds are prone to do. For a moment, just a brief moment, I allowed my mind to consider the unthinkable. He likes groups of people. Groups he can play with. He taunts him, like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it, and the more the people suffer before they die, the more power he gets. That was what the old man Walter McNeil had said, wasn't it? Well, here they were. A group of 4 people, out in the woods. And there was certainly suffering going on. Tony's hand looked like a fried lobster. Aster was an emotional wreck that couldn't stop sobbing. Margaret and Aster were angry at Tony and I were scared to death because we knew that we had not put the skeleton outside the tent. I shivered and pushed the thought away. Here I was, letting an old man's ghost story get to me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it away completely. The subtle fear remained, the constant, what if, in the back of my mind. I remembered what Aster had kept repeating this morning. Somebody put it there. And what had Tony said the day before? Somebody pushed me. Somebody or something. And with that thought, sleep took me. There exists a sound so monstrous, so utterly horrid, that no human ears should ever suffer through it. A sound that woke me from my uneasy sleep and infected my soul, spreading absolute terror throughout every limb. The moment I heard it, my entire body went numb. I was paralyzed with fear. Truly paralyzed, I could not move my body. To twitch even a muscle was a task as impossible as gliding through the air like a bird. No words in the English language exist that can describe this sound. The closest description I can give is the noise of 100 bloodthirsty wolves howling at the moon, sent through an audio distorter, such as the kind used at rock concerts, and then played back at maximum volume. The ground beneath my sleeping bag vibrated, and it felt as if the hounds of hell walked the earth around me. Such was the sound that ended my slumber. I felt Tony next to me, as rigid as I was. I could not so much as move my lips to cry out in fear. No sooner had the sound started before it ended, leaving behind a horrible silence. Then, a new sound took its place. Much quieter, much less bone-chilling, but horrible nonetheless. It was the sound of Margaret's screams. I suddenly snapped out of my paralysis. My body was free again. I felt Tony bolt upright next to me. My left hand went down to the tent floor next to my sleeping bag, blindly searching for my flashlight. I always kept a flashlight right beside my sleeping bag. My hand finally found it, and I grabbed the flashlight, switched it on, and ran out of the tent. Fire. That was the first thing I saw. The brown summer grass around us was on fire. I knew that we had left embers smoldering in the fire pit before we retired to our tents, but there was at least 5 feet of dirt surrounding the pit. Embers could not have accidentally started this blaze. I looked across from our tent and saw that Margaret and Astor's tent had collapsed. I ran straight towards it, running through the smoking, fiery grass that surrounded us. Margaret's wails continued, but they seemed to be getting further away. Astor was still in the tent, thrashing around and yelling for help. I got to the tent and picked up the fabric, allowing Astor to exit. When I raised the tent back up, I saw that the backside of it had been torn to shreds. 4 long gash marks ran across the entire side. "It got her! It took Margaret! It took her!" Astor cried. Her words were barely understandable through her hysterical sobs of terror. I shined my flashlight over the tent and across the clearing, and my blood ran cold. Margaret screamed as she was dragged across the ground. She was being pulled feet first into the forest, her head scraping against the rough stony ground. I caught only a brief glimpse of the thing that held her leg. It was dark, pure black. It was a person, or a beast, or both. I couldn't tell. It had no defined form. It was like a shadow, except even less than a shadow. It had no substance, no depth. It looked like a 2-dimensional drawing of a dark monster. Margaret disappeared into the pine forest, but her screams continued. Somehow, through all the fear, terror, and shock I felt, I was still able to run. A sort of blind fury overtook me. Now I wasn't just afraid. Now, I was angry. Angry at that thing that tormented my friends and I, that had taken Margaret from her tent as she slept. I sprinted, faster than I had ever sprinted before. I sprinted after Margaret. I forgot about Tony. I forgot about Astor. The only thing that mattered was saving Margaret from the dark beast that had her. I tore across the clearing and into the trees, following Margaret's screams. I held my flashlight ahead of me. I could see her. She was still being dragged across the forest floor. I willed my legs to pump faster. I ducked under branches, leapt over logs, and narrowly avoided crashing into trees. Yet no matter how hard I worked my legs, no matter how much energy I expended in pursuit of the unknown beast, Margaret grew further and further away. After a while I could only see her head, still being smacked by the uneven ground. Soon, even her head disappeared, and I had only her screams to guide me. But those grew ever fainter, and I realized that I would not be able to save her. When I couldn't run any longer, I stopped and bent over, gasping for air. Margaret's screams continued to grow more and more distant. Abruptly they ceased altogether. My head perked upwards. I strained my ears, but I heard nothing. The forest was completely still. I was alarmed. If Margaret were still screaming, that meant she was alive. But now there was only silence. Meaning I shook my head. I refused to let my mind consider that gruesome possibility. But deep down, in the back of my mind, I knew what had happened to Margaret. I just couldn't admit it to myself. I started jogging forward, calling out her name in a hoarse voice. "Margaret, Margaret, where are you?" I cried out. I suddenly noticed a new noise, one that was not there before. It was the sound of running water. I realized that I must be near the small stream that we had visited 2 days before. Picking up my pace, I walked towards the sound of the stream. My flashlight illuminated the path ahead, and I saw moving water. And then I saw Margaret. She was laying face down in the stream. Her black hair was waving gracefully in the eddies of the water. "Margaret!" I yelled as I sprinted towards her. As soon as I got within 5 feet of her, I stopped. The bright flashlight beam lit up her entire body. There were cuts and bruises along her legs and arms, and her clothes were tattered. Her right leg had 4 large cuts along it, no doubt where the beast had been holding her. And her head was bashed in. A large rock laid next to the stream. It had bits of skin and brain on it, where it had been used to crush her temple. One look into her eyes told me there was no life there. A dark current of blood had started washing down the stream. Margaret was dead. That thing, that beast straight out of Walter McNeil's story, had crushed her skull. For a few seconds I stood motionless, my flashlight focused on the lifeless body of my friend. Then I took a step backwards, turned around, and ran. It got Margaret. It got Margaret. This was all I could think as I sprinted back towards the clearing. It got Margaret, and now it's going to get us. We have to get away. The light from the grass fire guided me back towards the clearing. After what seemed like an eternity of sprinting, it was probably just a few minutes, I arrived back at camp. Dry grass burns quickly, and the fire had mostly burned out in the time I had been gone. Astor and Tony were huddled next to the ruined tent. Astor was rocking back and forth, and Tony sat next to her in a daze. His eyes were unfocused and foggy. I approached them, and they turned to look at me. "Get up, now. We have to go," I ordered. "Where's Margaret?" Tony asked, in a voice that sounded very far away. "Margaret's gone. Let's go." It was a considerable effort to keep my voice calm. "Go on. What do you mean gone?" Astor cried out. "She's fucking gone. Get up and go." This seemed to motivate Tony. He jumped to his feet and bolted towards the path that led back to Walter's house. I struggled to help Astor stand. Her knees were too weak to support her weight, and she had to lean on my shoulder. "Tony, wait," Astor sobbed. "Just let him go. We need to leave. Walk with me," I commanded her. Slowly but surely we managed our way towards the path. My eyes darted back and forth, searching for any danger, any sign of it. My anger was back. It had killed my friend, one of my best friends since childhood, and I hated it for that. I hated it with all my soul. But now was not the time for hate. I needed to ensure our survival. Margaret was gone, but we could still save ourselves. We entered the dark trail. I held my flashlight in my left hand as my right side supported Astor. The dirt path took a sharp curve, and we rounded it as quickly as we could. When we came fully around the corner, the bright beam of light from my flashlight revealed a grisly sight. Tony was up in one of the pine trees. His feet dangled about 4 feet from the ground. He had been completely impaled on the many branches that grew from the tree. Thinner, weaker branches had snapped off, but the thicker, Sturdier ones had held strong and penetrated his body. He had been forced completely up to the trunk of the tree. One branch protruded directly through the center of his neck. Another stuck out through the right side of his chest, revealing a horribly bent ribcage. His head hung downwards at an odd angle. All the pine needles nearby were speckled with blood, and a steady drip, drip, drip could be heard as warm liquid spilled from his fresh corpse. I felt poo climb into my throat, but I forced it back down. I grabbed Aster by the arm and gave her a rough pull. "Just keep walking, don't look at him," I said in a shaky voice. But Aster would not move. She stood rooted to the spot, her face deathly white and her eyes wide with shock. "Aster, we need to go now. We can still get away," I pleaded with her. She took 2 steps toward the body of Tony, and then ran the other way. "Stop! You're going the wrong way," I cried out as I began to chase her. She didn't seem to hear me. Panic had taken hold of her, and no amount of instructions or logic could get through to her. I tore after her, but I was already exhausted from chasing after Margaret, and I couldn't keep up. Aster had always been a better runner than me. She sprinted across the camp clearing in a blind panic as I begged her to stop. When she disappeared into the woods at the opposite end of the camp, I followed her in. I ran after Aster in the same way I had run after Margaret. I called out her name and asked her to wait. I had a sudden, terrible realization. Aster was in complete panic mode, following no clear path. The ridge we were upon was only about 100 yards wide, and had steep cliffs on both ends. With the overhead foliage blocking the moon and stars, a person who was running quickly might not see the edge in time to stop completely. I put my head down and ran faster than I had ever run before. Aster seemed to be slowing down now, perhaps becoming tired. I was gaining on her, but now I saw something else through the trees ahead. Stars. My gut sank when I realized that my fears had been correct. The cliff was no more than 20 yards in front of Aster. I was at least 10 yards behind her. I put every bit of energy I still had into running after her, and screamed, "Aster, you're going off the cliff." Aster understood the danger now, but it was too late. She attempted to stop herself, but her shoes slipped on the rocky ground and she tumbled forward. I slowed down as fast as I could, no more than 2 feet from the edge of the cliff. I reached my hand out and swiped at Aster's torso, attempting to grab her arm. My hand smacked against her shoulder, hard, and spun her around, but I had nothing to grab onto. Her terrified eyes met mine, and she opened her mouth to scream. But her scream was taken by the wind, and she was gone. I stood on the edge of the cliff. I didn't dare look over the side. Oh shit, oh shit. I was alone now. All of my friends were gone. I was alone in the forest. Alone with it. Somehow I still had the energy to run. I ran back towards camp as fast as my legs could carry me. I was determined to escape, to survive. Through all this, I still had my flashlight. It was a miracle I hadn't dropped it. I arrived back at the clearing. The grass fire had completely gone out. I made a straight line for the path that led out of the campgrounds, a swell of panic rising in my stomach. But something stood in my way, directly in the entrance to the path. It was Tony. Tony stood in the path. His body had been taken down from the pine. The branches through his throat and chest were still there. They had been snapped off the tree. Blood still ran from the open wounds on his body. Behind him, I could see it. The thing that had dragged Margaret to her death. The thing that had impaled Tony upon the tree. The black, two-dimensional being that had terrorized us. Strangely, it was somehow transparent. I could see it, but I could also see everything behind it. It held Tony's body up like a puppet. His head lolled to one side, and then turned upwards and looked at me with blank, dead eyes. Tony's mouth curved into a grin, but it was not a grin of his own. It looked as if his cheeks had merely been forced upwards by an outside force. Then Tony laughed. It wasn't a real laugh. It sounded as if air was simply being forced through his mangled vocal cords by the thing holding him up. His smile dropped, and then he spoke. Except it wasn't Tony speaking. It was that thing speaking through Tony. The voice was so garbled that I could hardly understand it, but I made out a single word. Run. The thing dropped Tony's body on the dirt path and disappeared. Tony crumpled into a heap of useless flesh. He looked like an action figure that some angry toddler had crushed and stomped into the ground. It had told me to run, but Tony's body in the center of the path sent another clear message. Don't take the trail. So I ran. I ran into the woods next to the path. I planned on turning back towards the trail when I could, determined to make my way out of this forest from hell. But there it was, right beside me. It followed along with me, keeping pace with me. Every time I tried to turn in the direction of the path, it was there. It was not going to let me escape. Like a dog herding sheep, it ran beside me. It kept itself between me and the trail, ensuring that I could not make my way onto the dirt that led to safety. I absolutely knew, that if I ever crossed its path I would be dead. I had no choice but to continue straight ahead, through the thick forest of pines. It had changed now. It took on a more definite form. It was no longer transparent, but pure black, as it was when it had taken Margaret. It was a beast with 4 long, thin legs that ended in huge claws. Its snout was lengthy and pointed, and its back was horribly arched. It lumbered along beside me, mad with thirst for the kill. I looked ahead and saw stars. I was nearing the other edge of the ridge, and if I did not change direction, soon I would go over the edge, just as Astor had. I curved my path to the left, away from the trail, but it was there too. It had disappeared from my right side and appeared on my left, continuing to herd me straight ahead. There was only one direction it wanted me to go. He taunts em, like a cat taunts a mouse before killing it. The words of Walter Menil echoed through my mind as I ground to a halt mere inches from the cliff. I turned around to face the horror that pursued me. My mind was completely empty. I had no more sense left in me. There was nothing I could do to protect myself. It stayed in the trees, several feet from the edge of the ridge, prowling back and forth like a giant cat, as its hideously long claws scraped against the rocks on the ground. I didn't dare try to run anymore. Every potential path of escape was blocked. I saw its mouth open wide to reveal a set of monstrous black teeth. It curled back onto its hind legs and looked like a spring that was waiting to be set loose. Its hind legs thrusted forward with enormous power, and it leapt at me from the trees. Sharp teeth bit into my chest as it crashed into my torso and took me over the ledge. Walter McNeil awoke with the sun creeping over the horizon. He hadn't slept well. Not well at all. Halfway through the night he had heard something awful, a horrible noise that seemed to come from the direction of the camp, where those kids were staying. He thought he had dreamt it, but he wasn't completely sure. Stepping out onto his front porch, he pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. He felt uneasy. He couldn't quite place his finger on it, but something was throwing him off. For some reason, on this morning, he felt drawn to it. Drawn to that damned stairway that stood so defiantly over the ridge. Perhaps it was the horrible noise that had awakened him in the night. Perhaps it was the fact that there was no smoke creeping up over the nearby campgrounds, as it had the past 2 mornings while those kids were camping. Walter walked along the short, narrow path that led to the stairway. The rising sun illuminated it, and to him, it was beautiful. It looked just like it had when he was a boy. It was exactly how he remembered it. Walter placed his foot on the first step and began climbing. In his mind he counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Any other man would be afraid to do such a thing, to climb out on an impossible stairway over a large cliff that looked as if it should fall over at any moment. But Walter knew it was safe. It had been there for 900 years and had not fallen over. At least, that's what those archaeologists claimed. And he had climbed out on it when he was a boy, hadn't he? It hadn't fallen over then. No, the stairway would not falter to the weight of Walter McNeil. It had been there when he was born, and it would remain long after he had died. Walter hesitated before taking the last step. Carefully he raised himself onto the final step and peered out over the valley. It was a beautiful view, better than the one he enjoyed from his porch. The sun illuminated the valley below in a splendid swirl of colors. But suddenly a darkness came over him. His skin tightened up, and goosebumps broke out over his arms. This place was no good. He could feel that. For the first time in his life, he could tell that the stairway was not something he should disturb. Walter quickly rushed down the steps, taking them 2 at a time. It wasn't until he was back on the trail to his house that he felt better. When the sense of darkness finally left him, he laughed out loud in the morning air. What an old fool he was, scared of a stupid hunk of rock that some crazy Injuns built 1,000 years ago. Nevertheless, his mind returned to that feeling of dread that had overcome him on the top step of the stairway. He thought back to the story he had told those kids a few days before. Walter shuddered and decided not to think about it any longer. He had lived in that house for nearly 50 years and had not had a single whiff of the supernatural, because it doesn't go after individual people, only groups. His subconscious goaded him. He shoved the thought out of his mind. That ridiculous story came from a superstitious old drunkard. It wasn't even worth considering. Stairway to heaven, my ass. But in his heart he knew that nothing could completely wash away the fear he now felt towards that place. The fear that had invaded his soul and taken root, like a weed, as soon as he arrived at the final step of the stairway. He could ignore it, rationalize it, explain it away as best he could, but the seed of doubt would never leave. Kids these days can't even count right. What good is school anyways, he thought to himself. Yeah, that's it. They just miscounted. Couldn't see it right in the setting sun. That's what happened. That must be it, he said out loud, attempting to console himself. That must be it, because there were exactly 40 steps on that damned stairway.